is liquidation not right for the company? So this is actually based on a director that got in touch. And essentially he had spoken to a few insolvency practitioners, and they'd all recommended that he liquidates the company, and that was the only option. It didn't feel quite right for him, and we just had a chat about it. So essentially he was a businessman, and he had lots of successful trading companies, and then there was one company that had ceased trading quite a while ago. And it didn't have any employees, there wasn't a pension scheme, and it was dormant. There was nothing there. It had no assets, and he thought it had no liabilities. And then there was a utility bill came through that was due by the company. So technically the company was insolvent, i.e. it couldn't pay its liabilities as and when they fell due, and therefore, he could put the company into liquidation, and that's what was strongly recommended. And when we discussed the company, and I checked that there wasn't any other liabilities whatsoever, and there wasn't. As I said, there was no employees, pension scheme, the landlord had been dealt with, all these things, the bounce back loan, business loan, all that. There was nothing else due other than this amount to the utility company, but it had no money to be able to pay it. The bank account had been shut down some time ago, and it had no funds in it. The company didn't have any tangible assets, physical assets, and it had no intangible assets either. There was no value to the goodwill. It didn't have a website. There was no contracts, patents, etc. So that was that. And when I asked him how much the utility bill was, it was about £7,000, just shy of, and the quotes he'd been given were technically less than that. I think some people are saying we'll charge 6,000 plus VAT, so it was sort of the same amount as the utility company. And listening to this, it didn't seem as if the liquidation would have been too complicated, so we would have charged a lot less. But I said to him, rather than paying a liquidator the fee, because you'll have to cover it personally, and for us to, or whoever, to do the liquidation, which would, end the legal life of the limited company, why doesn't he consider using that money, his own personal funds instead, to pay the utility company off, and then when it was able to, ensuring that everything was correct and met the criteria, dissolve the company. And he hadn't considered it because all the IPs he'd spoken to insisted on liquidation. And he thought about it, and he was asking me about what other ramifications are there with liquidation. Because obviously, yes, it does get rid of the liability. They would have had to have written it off. And yes, say, the liquidation fee would have been slightly less than paying the utility company. But it's also, when a company goes into liquidation, there's an investigation into the director's conduct. So he would have to deliver up all the books and records of the company. There would have been analysis carried out of the bank statements, of the management accounts. All transactions would have been reviewed, and not in relation to this case, but just generally speaking, if the liquidator finds anything untoward, director's misconduct, the director can be personally liable for that, and it is reported, as it should be, to the Insolvency Service, which is a government body, who can, if they feel it's necessary and in the public's interest, make a director disqualified from ever acting as a director again for a certain period, up to 15 years. So there are quite harsh ramifications in that regard, and that can affect other businesses. So if you have, viable trading limited companies that you're the director of, obviously it will affect that. When I was speaking to this director and I was explaining that, he was confident that he hadn't done anything wrong, and that wasn't a particular worry for him whatsoever, although it is a bit of a faff having to go back through all the books and records and provide explanations given the time since the company had ceased trading. But then there's also the It's on the public record, so at Companies House the liquidation documents are filed there, it's in the London Gazette and the creditors are notified. So it's not a secret, you can't keep liquidation hidden, and it can affect other things. So if in his other businesses he was to try and obtain a loan, for example, a business loan, that provider would see that there was a company that's gone into liquidation. I'm not saying that it would have stopped him from getting a loan, but these things are taken into consideration. And so I wanted to give him the full picture. I didn't advise him one way or the other. I just said, look, you can do this option, which is to pay the utility company, and then when check that you meet the criteria, etc., and then later on dissolve the company, or you could put it into liquidation, and I gave the pros and cons of each option to him, and I'm not going to say which option he picked, but essentially I gave him the information rather than railroading him into liquidation and thinking that's the only option and not discussing anything else. And I think he could sense that it wasn't, he wasn't getting the best advice, and so that's why it's always important to speak to another person. And we all do it. If we're getting a new kitchen, we don't go off the first quote we get and that one person. We always see what our options are, and you should apply that same theory to when you're in trouble and you're seeking professional advice. Always seek another opinion, and especially if you're not happy with the one that you're getting, or you feel as if they're holding you back, or they've got an alternative motive behind it all. So I just wanted to touch on that situation that came, where he came to us, because I just think it's a useful thing to know. Okay, thank you.